Hey guys, if you're shopping for knives and gear, make sure you check out the description of the video you're watching right now for a link to my Amazon store where I've compiled some of the very best items available, including some of my own personal recommendations. Thanks! What's going on, YouTube? Metal Complex here, and today I've got a super exciting knife review slash knife overview to do with you guys. This is the Shirogorov F95. This is actually a special Recon 1 edition of this knife, and then the laser work was done by Tyto Designs. Had to get that information from the gentleman who actually sent this for review, which is at herms.things. That should be a fairly familiar name to you guys. If you have not gone to follow him on Instagram, follow him. This guy has excellent taste. I'm going to say that because his taste is similar to mine, but he does have an amazing Instagram account. He's got a lot of really cool knives, knives that he is generous enough to send to me in groups. So thank you so much at Herms Things. It's because of people like him that I'm able to bring you guys this type of content and this regular content. Also, speaking of that, thank you so much to my generous patrons for supporting me right now. This channel would be literally impossible without you. If you'd like to check out my Patreon and support this channel, you can follow the link down in the description. It would absolutely mean the world to me. Anyways, let's go ahead and get a measurement on this knife. This is one of my dream knives, just to let you guys know. Absolutely phenomenal that I've been able to handle two different Shirogorov knives. The Hati, which is this, as I understand it, there's a lot of complexity in the Shirogorov line that I haven't quite figured out yet. The Hati is the carbon fiber and titanium version of this knife, and then the F95 is the all titanium version. And there are multiple variants of each different one of those, and there's different generations, blah, blah, blah. Overall length, this is not a small knife. It's coming in at about 8.75, 8.8 inches overall. Blade length is coming in at, I'm going to call that 4 inches, 3.9 at least. Cutting edge is also coming in at least 3.9 inches. The ratios on this thing are ridiculous. Oh my goodness. This thing is just crazy. Let's go ahead and do some size comparisons. I'm sorry, I literally didn't even realize I was picking that up and flipping it. We're going to talk about that here in a sec. Up against the Ontario Rat 1. Rat 1 coming in a little bit shorter at 8.6 inches overall. How about up against the Spyderco PM2? PM2's coming in at 8.3 inches overall. How about up against the Benchmade Griptilian, or in this case the Ritter Hogue? Ritter Hogue coming in at 8 inches overall. And last but not least, the Spyderco Para 3. Spyderco Para 3 coming in at 7.25 inches overall. How's the action, Metal Complex? How's the action on that Shirogorov? I've heard of the legendary multi-row bearing system that Shirogorov offers. For anybody who's not familiar with Shirogorov knives, yeah, brace yourselves. I'm going to talk for a sec. Imagine that. So, around the time that I started to discover the much higher end of the knife world, Shirogorov knives started popping up, right? And I remember people talking about Zero Tolerance has excellent flipping action. They flip so well. They flip, they've got these detents figured out in a way that's a little bit closer than what you'd expect to some of the really high-end makers. But I mean, it's not a Shirogorov. Every time I heard that so much on the forums, it's no Shirogorov, but it's pretty good. And I was like, what the heck is a Shirogorov? Long time ago. Igor Shirogorov, rest his soul, is no longer with us. I believe the company is run by his brother. He's clearly doing an excellent job because the legacy, or basically the legends about the Shirogorov action, is still to this day very, very true. Now, the very first Shirogorov I ever handled did not have the multi-row bearing system in it. It had washers, and it was insane. The washers in that knife were better than most flippers I've ever handled. This thing is an entirely different monster. Look, I'm going to tell you right now, yeah, you can get fall shot action on a budget knife. You can get fall shot action on a $200 knife. You can get fall shot action on a $500 knife. This is fall shot action, right? It's much more than that. This is frictionless, blah, 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 excellently tuned detent, everything. But because of that multi-row bearing system, this is a unique feeling action. There are extra moving parts in this, which I would actually assume would cause me to feel more imperfections. Because there are no perceived imperfections on the inside of this knife, all of those tiny little balls, there's a lot more in there than 6. I don't know how many there are. I think there's 6 or 7 outward spirals, and each spiral has 3 or 4 rows of bearings. So all of those moving bearings over a perfect surface, right, yields this feeling of bliss. I mean, this is as fall shut visually as you guys have ever seen a knife, but I'm telling you, this is unlike an action that I've felt. Actually, no, I felt it one other time, but the knife was 2.5 times the price of this knife. This knife is still very expensive. The most expensive knife I have ever handled had action similar to this, and it better at 2.5 times the price of this one, right? But that knife also had a much bigger, much heavier blade, which is saying something because this is already a 4-inch blade that's not skinny, right? This knife, under normal circumstances, I'd say, well, the length and mass of the blade is assisting there. I think that blade could be any length and mass, and it would still fall shut. This right here, I mean, if I was unaware of the left hand, I don't know that I'd be aware. Like if I, was just holding this and this was moving freely by itself and I had my eyes closed, I would not know that the other part of the knife was moving unless it was moving my hand back and forth. Does that make sense? I cannot feel it. I can't emphasize that enough. This is wonderful, and it's so nice because, I mean, if you're like me and you kind of have to experience these knives vicariously, either through the words of somebody on the forums or through a reviewer such as myself, oftentimes you wonder if that person owns the knife. Are they saying it's as good as I've heard that it is because they went ahead and paid all that money? Well, guess what, guys? This isn't mine. I didn't pay for it. Somebody sent it to me. It's going to cost me shipping to send it back to the person. So I'm giving you my unbiased thoughts. My answer to that question is yes, it's actually better. This is rivaled by very few. I'll tell you, the knives that I've handled that are close to it, the Koenig Arius, the Holt Spectre, which I actually have close to me here, some Begg knives, some Todd Begg Customs. Those are some that are close. Only one knife feels as good, and it was a Todd Begg Custom, and like I said, it was 2.5 times the price of this knife. But to this day, this is the best action that I have ever felt on a folding knife. It's absolutely wonderful. So there we go. It took me a little bit to get through the action part of this, but really, really good. Let's talk about blade thickness and weight here real quick. So now it's because of knives like this that I keep tape on the end of my calipers because I do not want to mark this up. Overall thickness, about 160 thousandths. That's about what I expected. We do have full titanium scales here, but you can see they are nicely milled out on the inside. So despite the fact that this knife is pretty long, I wouldn't say it's super thick. In fact, putting it up against the Spyderco PM2, it's right about the exact same thickness. Let's go ahead and weigh it. I can't wait to show that. Keep in mind, again, we've got 160 thousandths stock thick blade and a nearly 9-inch knife that is full titanium. What are you doing, scale? Come on now. Let's work with me here. I'm trying to prove a point. 4.44 ounces. Let me put that into perspective. Here's the Ritter Hogue, 8-inch knife, G10, and a cartridge liner. It weighs more. It weighs more than the Shirogorov F95. That is wonderful. Yeah, it's over an ounce an inch in terms of cutting edge to weight ratio, but I don't care. I don't care. On top of that, we have a large knife that is, even like the amazingness of it is further emphasized by the fact that its carry profile is actually really good for such a big knife. You guys remember I praised the aluminum body Microtech SOCOM Elite for being just over 5 ounces. What was it, 5.2? This knife blows that one away. I mean, in terms of, what it's made out of. I mean, yeah, the blade's not as thin, but you have a blade that is fully flat ground and nothing in the cutting path and truly about 4 inches of usable cutting edge, right? It is about the same body length as a PM2. It's definitely, even though it has a flipper tab, it's nowhere near as tall, and it's just longer than the Para 3. Now, it's heavier than both, but not by much, and especially considering the materials and how much blade you have, it's just amazing. Flipper tab, like I always say, is only going to bother you if you carry other things in your knife pocket other than your knife. If this was my knife, it would be the only thing in that pocket if I actually built up the courage to carry it. There's no reason to do a hardware check with my handy dandy Wii bit selector and Wii magnetic driver, 2 items that are very inexpensive and very recommendable. No matter who you are, you can find them down on my Amazon store. But anyways, no, sorry, I was trying to be funny. Shameless plug there. The hardware on this is sort of, the word proprietary is not the right word. It's special and unique, the Shirogorov designed hardware, but you actually can get a flathead or a coin in there to adjust those. On top of that, there's 2. And then there's the rear side of the pivot, and then there's the Chicago end of the other screw. That's amazing. Bravo. Oh my goodness. I mean, you don't really need any more structural integrity than this sort of very Rick Hinderer-esque standoff back there. It's plenty fine. It's plenty strong, completely open body, easy to clean out, even though there are pockets in there for a little bit of debris to catch. But talk about simplicity. About the only thing that's simpler than this. I mean, this is even easier to take apart than a Chris Reeve knife because there are less parts, right? About the only thing that's easier to take apart would be an integral knife. So that's incredible. Holy cow. I mean, we've got a whole bunch of wins in a row here. Right off the bat. Now, obviously, if you can't carry a knife of this length, that's the case in a lot of places, then this might not be your cup of tea, right? But if you can carry this knife, you're going to be pretty happy with that, especially if you like large knives. Let's go ahead. Did we cover everything there? I think we did. Let's go ahead and talk about the anatomy here. So now, like I said, there's a bunch of different versions of this. They've got the slim ones, they've got the regular thickness ones, they've got the ones with the inlays that are ribbed. They've got the turtle one, which looks like the outside of a turtle shell. And then they've got a bunch of different special editions. A whole bunch of those you can find actually at the Recon One website. And like I said, this was designed or done by Tyto Designs, making this a unique variant. It's very beautiful. I mean, you know, there's a bunch of different ones that you can get or that are out there, but this is very, very beautiful. And it's just executed flawlessly. This is one of those knives that exists in a caliber of production knives. Now, there are custom versions of these knives. This exists in the ultra high-end production world of folding knives, and it exists at the peak. And what I mean by that is, you know, I've handled a lot of knives that I would consider to be flawless for their price range, but they still have flaws that I kind of overlook. Little things like not rounding corners correctly, having minor friction on the inside of the pivot, having a final cutting bevel that's not absolutely perfect, right? But, you know, if it's $100 knife or sometimes even up to $200, there's little things that I can ever so slightly overlook, you know, even down to minute details like the absolute final fitment of the pivot and how it relates to the material around it. You know, there's a million teeny tiny little things that I could do. You know, having handled more and more and more expensive folding knives, my eyes pick things up that I perceive as a flaw that I had never experienced before, right? But I was like, oh, you know, after seeing so many knives in this price range, I look at that and I'm like, oh, this knife has no flaws. It has no manufacturing defects of any type. This is what happens when a machine is programmed so perfectly to execute something so flawlessly, and it's clearly been checked like a billion times over by, you know, whoever does the final fitment on these things, that it is an absolutely flawless knife in terms of construction. If you are looking to get, if that's your thing, if you're like, well, design is this or that, I like, you know, the aesthetics, you know, are one or another, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect ergonomic design, have the best, you know, blade material, blade shape, blah, blah, blah. I just want to know that it's put together as well as anything could possibly be put together on this earth. Shirogorov. That's that. I always reference, when I'm talking about knives like this, I always reference that line from Parks and Recreation where Ron Swanson is building that chair for Tom's Bistro, and Tom's like, hey, when are you going to finish up that chair? And he's doing it by hand, and he looks like he's about done, and he picks it up by the legs, and he smashes it, and Tom's like, what? Why'd you do that? And he was like, this one was too perfect. It almost looks, it doesn't look handmade. It looks machine-made, which is funny that he views that as a flaw, but that is absolutely the case here, ironically, with this knife, is that it is so perfect. It's machine-made, but it is beyond perfect. That's the best way that I can describe it. Give you guys a close-up here of everything so you can kind of understand what it is that I'm talking about. Every corner, every edge, every part of the flipper tab, even down to, you know, whether or not you can touch the blade on the inside of here, which you really can't. I mean, everything. And it's one of those things where you may not be able to understand what I'm talking about by just looking at it through a camera. But the fitment of everything is absolute. You will not find a, piece of metal hanging off. You won't find any line that is any thicker or thinner than anywhere else where it's supposed to be. Everything is, what's the word that I'm looking for? Deliberate. It's like they went over every last little line, every millimeter of the knife and said, yep, that millimeter of the knife is exactly the way that we designed it, and it came out the way that we wanted. So that's excellent. Speaking of excellent, let's take a look at this blade. We have not quite a fully flat ground blade, but very nearly. There's a small flat at the top that runs out about 60% or so the length, but it still carries good thickness down to the edge. While it does appear to be 90 degrees, rest assured, this area here is not sharp. I suppose you could strike a ferro rod on that if you wanted to, but what we have here is a blade that's going to be good for food prep. It's going to be good in a camping, hiking, hunting, fishing situation, and it's also going to be excellent at EDC, and it is actually long enough for you to, quote unquote, chop a pineapple in half if you really needed to. This is a purpose-built blade. And it is wonderful. Down to the edge, you do get nice and thin down here. You can get an enormous amount of performance out of it. It's made out of M390, which I think is a good blade steel for this type of knife. It's emphasized. The edge retention and performance are going to be emphasized in terms of the geometry and the steel. So I think that's excellent. The tip is definitely a puncture style tip, though it's not so thin at the edge or the tip, at the very tip, that I would say it's going to be overly delicate. I mean, this is definitely going to be a durable and performance-oriented blade, which is not something that you normally get. I also really like this little area up here that's got the jimping, and they have this little cutout. It just looks aesthetically futuristic and gentlemanly, right? I mean, this is an odd, it's like, if I were to guess what timeline this was from, I'd be like, I don't know. Is it from the future? Is it from the past? I don't really know. I also like Shirogorov's logo, the bear. It's just really nice. Also, the tumbling on here is nice. It's kind of a, more matte than satin tumbling. It's not ultra reflective, but it's really nice. I don't know exactly what to call it there. We have a finish on the titanium that's very similar to the finish that you might see on a Hinderer knife, but the blade is different. It's not quite like what I'd say Hinderer's working finish is, and it's definitely not what their stonewash is. It's something in between, and that's nice. I also like the small details on the pivot, right? The beveling around the pivot and the nice finish they've got on the face. And then this sort of, it's not really a pivot collar. It's just how the titanium has been milled around it. And then you can see the laser work is actually done in a circle around the pivot. Also, the laser work creates this shadow box effect with the scales, and it's just lovely. You can feel it. The laser work is textured just a little bit. Parts of the laser work are more matte than the finish behind it. The lanyard hole right here is just on one side, which I think is kind of a nice solution. It's there, it's not unsightly, but it is completely out of the way of the pocket clip, which, look at this. Look at this pocket clip. Not once have I ever seen a pocket clip that is more perfectly suited for the folding knife. It's almost its own thing. Like the pocket clip is like, it's doing its own thing, but somehow it manages to complement the rest of the knife perfectly. It's really, really nice. The screw actually holding it in is completely hidden, and the knife actually carries pretty deep. It's only that much that's sticking out of the pocket. I mean, this goes without saying, but the knife is like microscopically perfect in terms of the centering, and then it locks up at super early at about 20% or so. There is a steel lock bar insert that doubles as the over travel stop, which is nice. Everything is just wonderful. There's a heavier than normal detent on this guy, and it's kind of the in-between. It's not really a light switch, though it will. It's not really a push button. If you try to push button it, you're going to slide off the back of it here. You want to put your finger right there where the jimping is, and it deploys perfectly every single time. It does not matter if you hold it straight up and do it with your thumb. It's just going to deploy. It's also not so fall shut like the Spyderco Paysan that it'll come down and cleave your fingers. It's like it was tuned to fall quickly, but just it's like don't worry, I'm gonna give you the luxurious effects of fall shuttiness, but I'm gonna give you plenty of time to get your fingers out of the way if you need to, right? Like it cares about you. Never handled a knife that felt like it was created to absolutely care about the end user, not just in terms of utility, but in terms of ergonomic safety as well. Speaking of ergonomics, it's just wonderful. There's so much room on the handle. It's so comfortable. Everything's so nicely rounded. It's actual rounding on the outside of this thing. And it's just wonderful. There's not a hot spot anywhere. Even the jimping right here is knocked down enough that it's just not an issue. Fidget factor's off the charts on this guy. We have just everything you could possibly want. I mean, there's technically not, it doesn't feel like it's an actual detent ramp, but it's rounded enough that it'll get by it, but there's no double clutch. By the time this reaches your thumb, it's ready to drop. It's just fantastic. The only thing that I would have loved to see that would have made this knife essentially flawless. By the way, we didn't talk about the stop pin. Let's take a look here. There's the stop pin right there. Nice large stop pin. No rounding on the back there, but it's not necessarily something that's needed. One thing that I would have liked to see on this knife, because this design has been the same way for a while now, is contouring on the scales. Now, I don't know if they do that on some, but most of what I see, the base versions of this, which the absolute base version of this is just tumbled titanium and then the blade. And, excuse me, but I would like to see some contouring and some micro milling, and I know that they do some micro milling sometimes on their models. But the contouring would have absolutely just pushed this blade into absolute perfection zone for me. Now, not everybody, you know, needs or cares about the contouring, and truthfully, that's something that's not absolutely necessary, especially with how well they've got the rounding on the corners here. I mean, even this area right here, you see this a lot on some high-end folding knives. This area is nice so that when you come down for the flipper tab, it's very comfortable here. It's incredible. The only thing that would make it slightly more comfortable is just some contouring, you know, and it is something that I kind of like to see in this price range, but again, it's not absolutely necessary. So, is there anything that I don't like about this knife? I can't pick out anything that I don't like. I'll pick out things that I think still put this knife above, you know, other knives that are close to the same price or at the same price. It's the action. It's the overall execution of quality and the action on this knife that will still set it apart. You know, when people say, like, it's absolutely still a thing where people say, it's really good, but it's no Shirogorov. You're still going to hear that. These guys are still absolutely contenders. They're a powerhouse. My ideal version of this knife would be the monkey edge frag pattern version, just all tumbled and monkey edge frag. I've always thought that that was beautiful. And if they had contouring on there, this would be an Excalibur candidate. In fact, it is, in a lot of ways, an Excalibur candidate. It does a lot of things right. It doesn't check every single one of my boxes, but it is wonderful. Now, the biggest thing that's going to turn people off to this, I know that anybody who doesn't know what Shirogorovs cost, you know, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I could have stopped watching this a long time ago. What you're looking at here is, in its base form, about $1,000 knife. Different variants can actually be a little bit less, but if we're talking about the standard titanium F95 that is the newest variant, you're looking at about $1,000 knife, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less, depending on exactly what model you get and what materials are there. But that's roughly what you're looking at, I guess, in terms of this version. Now, this version exactly, with the laser work and the special Recon 1, it probably costs a little bit more, possibly a lot more. I don't know. I didn't ask him because I'm really just reviewing the standard version of the model. And that's a lot of money. That's an amount of money that nobody ever needs to get into. Need is a word that goes out the window, you know, because there's always somebody going, who would ever need a pocket knife? Nobody needs a pocket knife. You're not educating anybody by saying in the comment section that nobody needs this. We know. Everybody knows, right? You're not necessarily gaining anything in terms of utility with this knife by spending that much more money. You're gaining, in a lot of ways, exclusivity. You're gaining perfection in areas that some people just really, really want. You're absolutely gaining super high-end quality materials, but it's the way that they fit together, the extra steps that they take to ensure that you're getting a perfect product. And for what they've designed here, for the actual design, they have achieved a perfect version of what they set out to achieve. This is a wonderful knife. I cannot recommend it to everybody because it's simply so far over the price. I mean, I've recommended like some super, super high-end knives. This is going to go on my favorite knives of all time playlist, however, because it is. It's really, really nice to know that a knife that I have been drooling over for so long is actually what I expected and a little bit more. So that's wonderful. Thanks again to @herms.things for sending this guy along. If you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you'd like to check out my other content, I do, of course, have lots of videos of knives that are either expensive or inexpensive that I do or don't like, so check those out. And if you enjoy all my content, go ahead and click on this metal complex logo right here and subscribe because there's definitely more coming. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and have a